I walked into the living room with Mark, a man I had been secretly seeing for a few months. John, my husband, was sitting on the couch, absorbed in a TV show. His face lit up with a smile when he saw me, but it quickly faded when he noticed Mark standing beside me. "John, we need to talk," I said, my voice trembling slightly. John turned off the TV and looked at me, confusion spreading across his face. "This is Mark," I continued, pointing to him. "He wants you to share me with him, and we can't say no." John's face drained of color. He didn't respond. Instead, he stood up abruptly and walked out of the room without saying a word. The sound of the toilet flushing echoed in the silence that followed, leaving Mark and me standing there, unsure of what would happen next. Mark shrugged, his demeanor calm, betraying no concern. We stood there awkwardly, the minutes stretching on, thickening the tension in the air. I nervously glanced at the closed door, waiting for John to return. What would he say? How would he react? I couldn't imagine the storm brewing inside him. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps approaching. John walked back into the room, his expression unreadable. He was holding something, a small silver keychain, catching the light as it swung from his fingers. "What's that?" I asked hesitantly, my voice barely a whisper. John remained composed, his gaze steady. "This," he said calmly, "is the key to a new beginning." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I couldn't fully understand. Mark shifted uneasily next to me, sensing the seriousness of the moment. John continued, his voice steady but laced with quiet anger. "You bring another man into our home, into our marriage, and expect me to accept this?" I swallowed hard, guilt and fear tightening in my chest. "John, He cut me off sharply, his tone cold. "You made your choice," he interrupted. "Now you both face the consequences." He turned and walked away, leaving Mark and me stunned, unsure of what would happen next. A few minutes later, John returned with a small box in his hand, the box where we kept our wedding rings. My heart sank when I saw it. He opened it slowly, revealing its empty interior. "I flushed our wedding rings down the toilet," he said, his voice calm but filled with restrained emotion. "I guess we won't be needing them anymore." Shock and disbelief washed over me. The weight of his actions hit me like a punch. I exchanged a glance with Mark, who stood awkwardly, unsure how to react. John placed the empty box on the table with deliberate care and returned to the couch. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes burned with a new intensity one had never seen before. The room fell silent, broken only by the distant hum of appliances and the ticking of the clock. I struggled to find words to make sense of the turmoil inside me. "John, why?" I asked, my voice trembling. John's voice cut through the silence, sharp and full of hurt. "Because you brought another man into our marriage, into our home, and expected everything to remain the same." His words hit me like a painful reminder of the choices I had made. I had made my choices, and now I had to face their consequences. Guilt gnawed at me, mingling with a growing fear of what would come next. Mark shifted uncomfortably, breaking the tense silence. "John, maybe we should." "No!" John interrupted firmly, his gaze fixed on me. "There's no we anymore." His words sank deep into my chest, the reality of what he had said hitting me like a heavy weight. The symbolic act of flushing our wedding rings had left me reeling. Tears welled in my eyes, a mixture of remorse and helplessness threatening to overwhelm me. John's expression softened slightly as he glanced at me, a flicker of pain crossing his face before he composed himself again. "This is how it has to be," he said quietly, more to himself than to us. Mark remained silent, his presence a constant reminder of the rift I had caused. I wanted to reach out, to undo the damage, but John's calm resolve and the empty ring box were stark reminders of the irreparable breach between us. Hours passed in a strange silence, each minute stretching into eternity. Eventually, Mark excused himself, leaving me alone with John and the echoes of what had happened. He retreated to our bedroom, closing the door behind him with finality, as if to seal the end of our shared life. I sat on the couch, numb, trying to process the devastating consequences of my actions. The weight of John's quiet anger and his deliberate gestures, the flushed rings, the empty box, pressed down on me like a heavy burden. As night descended, casting shadows across the room, I realized with a sinking feeling that John's calm exterior masked a storm of hurt and betrayal. The object in his hand had become a symbol of our shattered trust and the unraveling of everything we had built together. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. John's voice was steady, but it was tinged with hurt. His eyes, usually warm and comforting, now held a glint of anguish. "Because you brought another man into our marriage, into our home, and expected everything to remain the same." Tears welled up in my eyes as I struggled to find the right words. "I love you, John," I said, my voice breaking. "But I also love Mark. I thought we could make this work together." John shook his head slowly, disbelief palpable. "You can't have both of us," he said quietly, his words final. "You made your choice the moment you brought him into our home." Mark, sensing the tension, stepped forward tentatively. "Maybe we can talk about this," he suggested, his voice calm but uncertain. "We can find a solution that works for everyone." John's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "The only solution I see," he said firmly, his tone cutting through the air like a knife, "is for both of you to leave." The finality of his words filled the room, leaving no room for argument or negotiation. I glanced at Mark, silently pleading for him to say something, to offer a way to fix this, but Mark hesitated, visibly overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. "John, please," Mark began, his voice shaking. "We care about you. We don't want—" "Don't pretend this is about caring," John snapped, his voice sharp. The room fell silent again, the tension thickening. I felt the weight of John's accusation, the guilt of my actions pressing down on me like a heavy burden. How had everything spiraled so out of control? "I never wanted to hurt you," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the charged atmosphere. John's expression softened for a brief moment, a shadow of the love and warmth we had once shared flickering in his eyes. "But you did," he said quietly, his voice full of sorrow. "You shattered everything we had." I reached out, wanting to touch him, to erase the pain on his face, but he stepped back. His retreat was a physical manifestation of the emotional distance that now separated us. Mark shifted uneasily, unsure of his place in the unfolding drama. "John, maybe we should give each other some time," Mark suggested tentatively, his voice uncertain. John's gaze hardened, his resolve solidifying. "Time won't change what you've done," he said firmly. "You both need to leave now." The finality of his words left no room for doubt. Mark looked at me silently, pleading for guidance, but I had none to give. The reality of our shattered marriage and the consequences of my choices crashed down on me with brutal clarity. With heavy hearts, Mark and I gathered our things in silence, packing away the remnants of a life that had splintered beyond repair. John watched silently, his eyes betraying a mix of pain and resignation. As we walked out of the house, the weight of John's calm anger and the devastation of our broken vows pressed down on me with every step. The night air was cool against my skin, a sharp contrast to the heat of the emotions swirling inside me. Behind us, the door closed with finality, echoing the end of our shared dreams. I glanced back one last time, catching a glimpse of John standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. In that moment, I knew that John's calm resolve and quiet anger would haunt me for the rest of my life. The confrontation was over, but the consequences of my actions had only just begun to unfold. After we left John's house, Mark and I stayed together, but despite the physical distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that John wasn't done with us. His calm demeanor had been unsettlingly composed, too accepting for the gravity of the situation. I knew him well enough to sense that beneath his calm exterior, John was plotting something. Days passed, and I existed in a haze of uncertainty. I couldn't sleep or eat properly, haunted by the echoes of John's quiet anger and the broken pieces of our marriage. Mark tried to reassure me, suggesting we move on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that John had a plan to turn the tables on us. Then, one evening, a text arrived on my phone. It was from John, a simple, chilling message: "Come back home. We need to talk." Mark frowned when he saw it over my shoulder. "You can't seriously be considering this," he said, concern thick in his voice. I hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. "I need to know what he's planning," I whispered. Mark shook his head, his frustration clear. "He's not going to forgive this easily," he warned. It could be a trap, but the gnawing uncertainty wouldn't leave me. Despite Mark's advice, I made my decision. I needed answers, closure, in whatever form it came. The drive back to our house was nerve-wracking. Every mile felt like a step closer to an unknown fate. When I arrived, the house was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. I let myself in, my heart pounding in my chest. John was waiting in the living room, sitting on the couch with a bottle of wine in front of him. His gaze met mine as I entered, his expression unreadable. "You came," he said, his voice calm, without the anger I had expected. I nodded, unable to speak. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, the weight of our fractured relationship hanging in the room. John gestured to the couch opposite him, a silent invitation to sit. I hesitated before lowering myself onto the seat, acutely aware of the space between us. He poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to me. I took it cautiously, unsure of his intentions. We sat in silence for a long moment, each sip of wine a small attempt to ease the tension. Finally, John spoke, his voice steady. "I've had time to think," he began, his eyes fixed on mine. "About what happened, about us." I swallowed hard, unsure of what to expect. "John, He raised a hand, silencing me. "Listen," he said softly. "I'm not here to rehash the past. What's done is done. But we need to move forward." His words threw me off. I had expected anger, accusations, but instead there was a calm resolve in his tone. It unsettled me even more. "I've made a decision," John continued, his gaze unwavering. "I want a fresh start." I blinked, processing his words. "A fresh start?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. John nodded, his expression serious. "Yes, but there are conditions." My heart raced, a mix of anticipation and dread. "Conditions?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching mine. "You and Mark leave town tonight, and you never come back." The demand hit me like a physical blow. "John, No," he interrupted, his tone firm. "This is not negotiable. You brought him into our lives, into our home. Now you both leave, and we'll pretend this never happened." I struggled to find words, trying to comprehend the weight of his ultimatum. "What about us?" I finally managed, my voice trembling. John's gaze softened, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "There is no more us," he said quietly. "Not after this." Tears welled up in my eyes, a mix of regret and sorrow overwhelming me. "John, please." He shook his head, his resolve firm. "It's too late for please," he said gently. "You made your choice. Now you have to live with the consequences." Silence enveloped us again. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy shroud. The wine sat untouched in my hand, its bitter taste lingering on my tongue. Minutes passed, 10, and still I couldn't speak. Finally, I nodded, a silent acceptance of the inevitable. "I'll go," I whispered, my voice breaking. John nodded, his expression unreadable. "Goodbye," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. I stood slowly, the room spinning as I walked out of our house for the last time. John's calm resolve, His meticulously laid plan had won. The ache in my heart and the weight of my choices followed me into the night, leaving behind a trail of shattered dreams and unanswered questions. As I drove away, leaving John's house behind, a cold sense of foreboding settled over me. His unnerving calm had left an indelible mark, foreshadowing the turbulent weeks ahead. The days blurred together in a haze of uncertainty and fear. John wasted no time in filing for divorce. His actions were swift, methodical. The legal documents arrived like nails in a coffin, each page a stark reminder of the life I had destroyed. "He's asking for full custody," my lawyer informed me grimly. "He's citing your affair as grounds for instability." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Full custody. The nightmare I had feared was taking shape before my eyes. I had always believed I was a good mother, but now my actions were threatening to strip me of everything I held dear. Mark, once my support, began to withdraw under the weight of our crumbling relationship and the mounting legal pressures. His calls grew less frequent, his visits sporadic. Guilt overwhelmed me, knowing I had dragged him into my betrayal. "I can't do this," Mark confessed one evening, his voice strained with emotion. "I thought we could make it work, but everything's falling apart." Tears streamed down my face as I listened, knowing deep down that he was right. Our foundation had been built on deceit and betrayal, a shaky ground that couldn't sustain us any longer. Days turned into weeks, and the legal battle intensified. John's lawyers presented evidence of my affair, painting a damning picture of my character. Witness statements, text messages, photographs. Everything laid bare for the court to scrutinize. In the courtroom, I sat with a sinking feeling, watching as my life unraveled before me, before the judge's eyes. John, composed and resolute, presented himself as a stable, devoted parent, contrasting sharply with the image of instability painted of me. "He deserves full custody," the judge pronounced. Her words were a hammer blow to my hopes. "Miss Smith, your actions have shown a disregard for the well-being of your children," she continued. I felt numb as the reality sank in. Full custody granted to John. My children, the center of my world, slipping away from me because of choices I could never take back. Outside the courtroom, John approached me with cold determination in his eyes. "This is what you brought upon yourself," he said quietly. "I warned you there would be consequences." Tears welled up in my eyes as a wave of regret and helplessness overwhelmed me. "John, please," I pleaded, grasping for words that might undo the damage. But he turned away without another glance, leaving me to face the wreckage of my life alone. The weeks that followed were a blur of heartache and loss. I moved out of our home, stripped of custody rights, and left with only supervised visitation. Every moment with my children felt like a cruel reminder of what I had lost. Their confused gazes haunted me as they struggled to understand why Mommy couldn't be with them all the time. Mark, burdened by guilt, eventually withdrew completely. "I can't do this anymore," he confessed during our final conversation. "I'm sorry, but I need to move on." His departure left me utterly alone, grappling with the consequences of my actions in a world that had turned against me. Friends and family, once pillars of support, distanced themselves, unable to reconcile the person I had become with the one they had once known. As the months dragged on, I watched from a distance as John rebuilt his life, a life that no longer included me. He moved into a new home, filled with memories I was no longer a part of. Social media pictures painted a portrait of happiness and stability, a stark contrast to the chaos consuming my every moment. John's calm, composed exterior had hidden a ruthless determination to exact his revenge, and he had succeeded. I had lost everything. My marriage, my children, my dignity, all because of a betrayal that had spiraled out of control. In the solitude of my new reality, I faced the painful truth. I brought this nightmare upon myself. My selfish, reckless choices had led me down a path of devastation, one from which there would be no return. As I stared at the empty rooms of my new apartment, Haunted by memories of a life I once had, I knew the truth. John's calm resolve had sealed my fate. The nightmare I now lived was a consequence of my betrayal. Punishment I would never escape.